Bomber line had advanced to Tokyo at last. And what a bomber line. 400 plane raids. 500. 600. 1,000.
On the night of March 10th, 1945, Tokyo was the victim of one of the most devastating aerial bombardments of the Second World War. The raid came without warning. Planes flew below 10,000 feet. Their only weapons, bombs designed to set ablaze the fragile residential buildings of central Tokyo.
The bombs were falling like rain. The wind was very strong, like a typhoon, and the fire was like a tornado crawling along the ground. My father, my mother, my sister, and I held hands and ran away through the fire. Then a gust of wind blew me away, and I was on my own in a sea of fire.
The 8-year-old girl was grabbed by a stranger and next remembers being buried beneath a crowd of people and losing consciousness.
I heard a human voice. Japanese don't die like this. Japanese must survive. You must not sleep. I was pulled out from the bottom of the pile of people, and I discovered that the person talking to me was my father. Then I looked at where I had been. There was a mountain of black, dead bodies. I was the only survivor under all those dead people.
The all clear sounded shortly after 2:30 in the morning. The raid had lasted around 2 hours and 40 minutes. American reports show that in that one raid, the B-29s dropped over 1,500 tons of incendiary bombs onto a target area measuring just 10 square miles. At least 100,000 Japanese civilians were killed on that single night. 1 million lost their homes. Fires burned for days.
Close-up cameras show the scars of those spectacular fire strikes last March. 51 square miles of LeMay treatment.
The key figure behind the bombing strategy was the cigar-chomping General Curtis LeMay. He had arrived in the Pacific to lead 21 Bomber Command. He was on record as saying, "I'll tell you what war is about. You've got to kill people. And when you have killed enough, they stop fighting."
Succeeding bomber groups add their devastation to the smoking targets.
Most of Japan's major cities were subjected to prolonged conventional bombing. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya. This was the alternate plan then, favored by the Air Force and the Navy, to bomb and blockade Japan into submission. They knew it would take time, and as LeMay had been told by his superiors, failure would mean an invasion of Japan, costing 500,000 more American lives.
We often lose sight of the fact that the conventional bombing was destroying cities and killing thousands of people. Japan was under a very heavy and a very complete blockade, so that they were facing the food shortages. There was growing discontent among the population, and that was a matter of concern to the emperor and to his advisors.
What they were aiming for was bombardment that would incinerate thousands of Japanese and a blockade that aimed expressly to starve to death Japanese by the millions and hope that the emaciated survivors surrender.
Few in the military leadership questioned the morality of bombing Japanese cities. A bigger question was, would it work? The Japanese High Command seemed unmoved by the suffering of the civilian population. 80% of Tokyo had been destroyed, but there was still no sign of surrender. In the spring of 1945, American public opinion seemed prepared to wait.
If you look at the very few public opinion polls of that time that address the question of invasion, you will find that the American public is saying we would prefer to wait and use bombardment blockade rather than hurry now to invade Japan by margins above 70%.
Standard bombs did that. Conventional air attack devastated Japan. Yokohama after incendiary assault. Japan was being smashed to submission.
But with the war in Europe drawing to an end, there were those in the government and the military who were convinced that waiting was not an option. The timetable for ending the war in the Pacific had, after all, already been agreed to by Roosevelt and Churchill.
Here was testimony to the effectiveness of our incendiary raids. Tokyo, 80% destroyed. 100,000 dead.
The idea of waiting, of bombardment and blockade until the Japanese are starved or give up in that respect, means that you are not sure when it's going to happen. And the great objective of General Marshall and Secretary of War Stimson is to complete the war in, if possible, 12 months, if necessary, 18 months after the end of the war in Europe. Otherwise, they felt they simply would not have American public support.
The mortal remains of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was President of the United States during years of dread crisis, are borne to the White House with stately ceremony.
In April 1945, the American nation was united in grief at the sudden death of President Roosevelt. Roosevelt had been a great reformer at home and had guided America through the darkest days of the war to the brink of victory. He was succeeded by his vice president, Harry Truman. Truman was an unknown quantity, but it was assumed that American strategy overall would remain the same. There was one policy area, however, that might just change.
There are many battalions of combatant chemical troops ready with their special weapons to fire gas for retaliation when the Axis starts chemical warfare.
Under Roosevelt, it was Allied policy that these deadly weapons could only be used in retaliation. Now the policy of no first use might be reconsidered.
The Chemical Warfare Service is responsible for the research and development of new war gases.
As Washington struggled to find a way to end the war as quickly as possible, military planners had already been thinking what had been regarded as unthinkable: to strike against Japanese civilians using poisonous gas.
And chemical service troops. The Chemical Warfare Service.
The plan had first been drawn up in April 1944 by members of the U.S. Army's Chemical Warfare Service. It contained a list of 25 Japanese cities, their populations, and the quantities of poison gas that American bombers would drop.
The gas attacks amount to a gas attack on every principal city in Japan. And some of the estimates of casualties reached into the millions, 7, 8, 9 million.
The Huntsville Chemical Warfare Arsenal can manufacture more mustard gas in one day than was manufactured by us in all of World War I.
Mustard gas would be used in Tokyo because mustard gas adheres to wooden structures. And they also talked about having the gas attacks take place during daylight rather than night, because in daylight there would be more civilians afoot and it would instigate panic.
You're looking at 70,000 drums of mustard gas.
The idea of the gas attacks is not only to soften up Japan, but make it impossible for Japan to even put up a defense against an invasion.
The Chemical Warfare Service is headed by the chief of CWS, Major General William N. Porter.
On June 9, 1945, the plan to use massive gas attacks on Japanese cities in advance of X-Day was submitted to Major General Porter. There is no direct evidence that this plan to unleash chemical weapons on population centers was approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What is clear is that they were interested in a more limited application. The central figure was Army Chief of Staff General Marshall. He told Secretary of War Henry Stimson that chemical weapons were no less humane than phosphorus bombs and flamethrowers. And a few weeks later, he sent a memo on poison gas to Admiral King. Marshall believed chemical weapons might be needed to wipe out pockets of resistance in the event of an invasion. And with good reason. At the very moment that the U.S. military was examining the use of poison gas, American troops were fighting the last bloody battle on the doorstep of Japan itself.